Ever wondered how Vikings spent months on icy seas without a single fire? Picture this. You're on a Viking ship in the year 900. Your beard's frozen solid. The sea spray turns to ice before it even hits the deck. Your fingers, you stopped feeling them hours ago. Now here's the nightmare. You can't light a fire, not even a tiny one. Sounds dumb, right? You're freezing, there's wood all around you, and somehow fire is off limits. But this is how Vikings crossed oceans. Whole crews trapped on open decks for days, sometimes weeks, in Arctic winds, and not a single flame on board. Why? Because on a Viking ship, warmth meant death. Let me explain something most people don't realize. Those ships weren't cozy wooden boats. They were floating firebombs. Every plank was soaked in tar. Every rope was dry hemp. Every sail coated in pitch. You strike one spark, and boom. You're home. Your weapon. Your only way back. Gone in seconds. So yeah, they froze on purpose. Because a little comfort could wipe out 50 men. And that's not a guess. Archaeologists dug up Viking longships. No hearths, no chimneys, no ash pits. Nothing. You know what that means. They never built a single safe place for heat. Ever. But here's where it gets wild. They didn't just survive it. They trained for it. Frostbite wasn't failure. It was a rite of passage. Cold wasn't the enemy. It was the filter that proved who deserved to make it home. Imagine being that rower, half blind from snow glare, salt crust on your lips, wind screaming in your ears, and you know the guy next to you is shaking too hard to pull the oar. Nobody stops, because stopping means dying together. So you keep going, teeth clattering like dice, breath fogging like smoke. That was their version of central heating, movement. And the crazy part, they still had to eat, sleep, and steer, all while wrapped in frozen furs that smelled like seal guts. Luxury, right? Here's the thing most history books skip. Viking ships didn't have decks you could hide under. They were open, just one big wooden shell slicing through waves. No cabins, no walls. You slept under the sky, under snow if you were lucky. So the question isn't, how did they stay warm? It is, how did they not just die? And here's the twist. They had heat. Just not the kind you're thinking of, because while everyone else in the medieval world was huddling around fires, the Vikings learned to turn their bodies into heaters. They hacked warmth itself. But how? Let's just say it wasn't about fire. It was about flesh. So here's the secret. The Vikings didn't fight the cold. They partnered with it. They learned fast that you can't outsmart the North Sea, so they started outsmarting their own skin instead. Layer after layer, wool, fur, linen, seal hide. And here's something weird. They wore wool closest to their body, not fur. Why? Because wool traps heat even when it's wet. Fur just looks fancy. Wool saves your fingers. Now imagine this scene. Dawn breaks, your beard's got icicles, and your tunic feels like sandpaper. You've got to stitch your sleeves shut to keep out the wind. Yeah. They literally sewed their cuffs every morning, like wearable thermos flasks. Try explaining that to someone complaining about a broken heater. They'd tuck animal fat or dried moss into their boots, makeshift insulation. Not glamorous, but it worked. And get this, some sagas even mention them greasing their faces with fish oil to stop the skin from cracking. Smells like hell, but hey, better than frostbite. But here's where it gets stranger. They didn't just warm themselves, they shared warmth. Viking ships were crowded on purpose, rowers shoulder to shoulder, sleeping basically on top of each other under a giant skin tarp. That wasn't bad planning. That was the heating system. When one man's body cooled, the next man's kept him alive. You were literally a radiator with a pulse. And if you thought that sounded miserable, it was. But it worked. Because the North didn't reward comfort, it rewarded teamwork. Let me explain something you probably didn't know. Viking ships didn't even stop to camp every night. Sometimes they'd row through darkness, eating cold, half-frozen fish, and taking turns sleeping upright. No fires, no tents. Just fur, skin, and stubbornness. And here's the kicker. They liked it that way. The cold was a badge of pride. If you couldn't handle it, you didn't belong on the sea. There's an Old Norse phrase that basically means, the cold tests the manual. To them, shivering wasn't weakness, it was proof you were alive. Think about that. They turned what would kill most people into their cultural flex. The worse the weather, the tougher your legend. And yet, you're not ready for the punchline. Even with all that grit, even with the fish oil and fern body piles, there's one thing they could never solve, the fire problem. Because sometimes, no matter how smart your tricks were, you needed real heat to cook, to dry clothes, to stop dying slowly. But if lighting a fire meant blowing up your ship, what did you do? The answer? You took the fire off the ship. Here's the cruel joke of Viking life. The thing that kept every village alive on land, fire, was suicide at sea. These ships weren't just wood. They were tar, rope, pitch, and oil-soaked cloth. Every plank was basically a candle waiting for a match. And guess what the Vikings did before every voyage? They greased the hull to keep water out. So yeah, the whole boat was a floating torch. Now picture this. It's midnight, the sea's throwing ice like knives, and your clothes are soaked. Someone suggests lighting a small cooking flame in a shield bowl. Everyone stares. They know that one ember can jump, hit the rope line, and the whole deck goes up. Fire spreads faster on tar than rumor in a small town. 4 minutes later, gone. Ship, crew, legends, ash on black water. Let me explain something. Viking ships were everything. They cost years of work, forests of oak, and more silver than most families saw in a lifetime. Lose the ship, and you didn't just die, you erased your clan's future. So, no fires. Not ever. They'd rather freeze their lungs solid than risk a spark. But that came with a new enemy. Wet. Once your clothes got soaked, they stayed soaked. No drying, no heat, no mercy. Some crews tied spare sails above the deck to block sleet, which just trapped more water. Frost formed on ropes, so thick they had to break it off with axes. And the worst part, the cold wasn't slow. You could go from shivering to half paralyzed in under an hour. One wrong wave, one man falling asleep at the oar gone. The North Sea didn't forgive naps. But here's the irony that'll twist your brain. They could have built safe fires. A clay stove, a stone hearth, a metal pan, other sailors managed it later. They had the brains. They even had blacksmiths on board sometimes. So why didn't they? Because for Vikings, risk wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Fire was sacred, the gift of the gods. You don't trap a god on a tar boat. You respect it, or it kills you, and that's when it hits you. They didn't avoid fire because they were primitive. They avoided it because they understood danger better than anyone else alive. Here's the kicker. They still needed it. To cook, to melt tar, to repair the ship. So how do you use something that wants to kill you? Easy. You take it somewhere even worse. So here's what they did. When Vikings needed fire, they didn't use it on the ship. They used it off the ship. They'd beach the longboat on some miserable frozen shore, drag tar buckets and food to land, and build their fires there. Meals, repairs, everything done in the freezing dark, knee-deep in slush. Then they'd shovel sand over the ashes, pack up, and row again. No warmth carried back on board. The sea stayed pure, deadly, and fireless. Sounds insane, right? But that was the point. To them, pain wasn't a mistake. It was a system. You don't train for the North Sea by staying comfortable. You train for it by almost dying 100 times and still rowing anyway. Let me put it another way. Viking toughness wasn't just about muscle. It was about rules, unbreakable, stupid-sounding rules that kept you alive. No fire on deck was one of them. Another? Never trust the calm sea. Because calm seas were when storms like to sneak up. And here's the brutal irony. The same men who raided half of Europe couldn't risk lighting a single candle on their own ship. They could burn monasteries, but not dinner. Life's got a sense of humor, doesn't it? But let's zoom in for a second. Because this decision wasn't just about fire. It was about control. Vikings didn't believe in taming nature. They believed in surviving it. You can't tame the wind. You can't stop the waves. So you stop yourself. You strip away comfort until you're harder than what's trying to kill you. That's why they trained young men to sleep in the open, to bathe in cold water, to row until their hands split. It wasn't for fun. It was programming. By the time they boarded a ship, the pain didn't register as pain anymore. It was just the air they breathed. Now here's the twist most people miss. Vikings didn't think the cold was an enemy. They thought of it as a judge. If you could endure it, you deserved the sea. If not, well, the North would take you quick. And the crazy part? This mindset worked. They crossed the Atlantic before anyone else. They built empires from ice, all while freezing, half-starved, and barefoot. Because when you live by rules that hurt, comfort can't control you anymore. And if you're still here, that says something. You actually care about the parts of history most people scroll past. Hit like and subscribe. It tells me there are still people who want the truth, not the legend. Be honest, could you have lasted a night on that ship? No fire, no warmth, just cold breath and pride? I read every comment, even the brutal ones. So yeah, they could have built stoves. They just didn't want to, because every spark was a risk. And for a Viking, dying from fire was shame. Dying from cold, that was honor. Now flip it. Imagine the opposite. A world where warmth meant weakness, where a man's worth was measured by how long he could suffer in silence. That's not survival anymore. That's ideology. And that's the punch in the face. They didn't survive despite the cold. They survived through it. They turned frost into faith. You know what's wild? They never needed a hearth because they already carried one inside their skulls. Call it mind heat. Kind of anger they fed on instead of flame. See, Vikings weren't built for comfort. They were built for control. Every muscle, every habit, every superstition was a way to hold back panic in a world that tried to kill you. You can't light a fire on a ship full of pitch and rope, so you light it in your head instead. That's what the sagas really describe, not warmth, but willpower. When you wake up on a deck coated in ice, your beard frozen to the planks, and you still grab an oar, that's not courage. That's ritual. It's the daily ceremony of refusing to break. They had tricks, sure, layer wool, wrap hides, huddle for body heat, but those were just survival tools. The real insulation was mental. They trained themselves to believe that pain was proof they were alive, that every shiver was a kind of prayer, and the louder the sea screamed, the more sacred it felt. Think about that. Most of us light fires to chase away the dark. Vikings stared into the dark until it flinched first. They turned suffering into something holy. And Jor, the sea god, he didn't promise safety. He promised storms. Odin didn't reward comfort. He rewarded endurance. In that world, warmth wasn't mercy. It was temptation. If you gave in, you lost the edge that kept you alive. That's why even on shore, they built longhouses with hearths that smoked and stung your eyes. They could have vented them better. They just didn't. Because easy breathing was for weak lungs. The discomfort was the point, a daily reminder that life owed you nothing. So when they went back to sea, the transition wasn't harsh. It was natural. The deck was just another test, another altar. Each freezing gust a sermon. Earn it again. Modern people look at that and call it madness. To them, it was the only logic that made sense. If the gods lived in the storm, then to reach them, you had to suffer like they did. You had to let the cold strip everything away, until all that was left was will, and that will burned hotter than any fire ever could. So that's what mind heat really was, not comfort, but identity. The North didn't just shape their bodies, it sculpted their souls. When you live where nothing grows, you start to think survival itself is sacred. And if survival is sacred, then suffering becomes your prayer. Every cut, every frostbite scar, every lost fingertip, proof that you existed in a world designed to erase you. That's what made them terrifying to everyone else. They weren't fearless because they didn't feel pain. They were fearless because they'd already made peace with it. The rest of the world ran from discomfort. They hunted it. That's why you can't really copy Viking toughness. You can lift weights, grow a beard, get tattoos, but you're still warm. You still have walls, heaters, and escape routes. They didn't. The North stripped them down until there was no distance between body and belief, and that belief built empires. Not because they conquered others, but because they conquered themselves first. You can't row through storms for days unless your mind believes the storm is part of you. You can't cross oceans unless you've already accepted that death might come before sunrise. That's the paradox. Their power came from surrender. Not to fear, but to the truth that nature doesn't care. And when you finally stop begging it to care, you get free. Maybe that's why their stories still burn today. Because deep down, we envy that clarity. They didn't pretend the world was fair. They just decided to fight it anyway. And in doing that, they found something we've mostly lost, a sense that struggle meant something. Even now, you can feel it in the culture. Every time someone says, embrace the grind, or stay hard, that's the echo of an old northern gospel. Cold as iron, honest as death. They didn't worship strength, they worshipped survival. And survival was never pretty. It was blistered hands, split lips, frozen tears. It was rowing blind through sleet while the sea tried to unmake you. But that's what made it sacred. So no, they didn't light fires on their ships. They didn't need to, because by the time they set sail, the fire was already inside them. And centuries later, we still see that glow in the sagas, the ruins, the myths, in that impossible endurance that says, I will not be comfortable, and I will not die quietly. That's the real heat of the North. The one that never goes out.